Hello, I'm Kaiser and welcome to Moose Reads. Before I get started, I want to say that the opinions that I give here are my own opinions. They are extremely subjective. If I dislike a book, it is not a reflection on the author, and it is not a reflection on people who do like it. Different people have different tastes, and that's okay. Today, I will be reviewing the entirety of Solo Leveling by Chugong. This is a fantasy series. The reason I'm doing them all together is that most of my comments are true for the entire series, but also because the books end in kind of random places, and I read them all very quickly a month ago, and cannot remember what was in which volume. The description, from Wikipedia rather than Amazon this time, says, "In a world where hunters, human warriors who possess supernatural abilities, must battle deadly monsters to protect mankind from certain annihilation, a notoriously weak hunter named Sung Jin-woo finds himself in a seemingly endless struggle for survival. One day, after narrowly surviving an overwhelmingly powerful double dungeon that nearly wipes out his entire party, a mysterious program called the System chooses him as its sole player and in turn gives him the unique ability to level up in strength. This is something no other hunter is able to do, as a hunter's abilities are set once they awaken. Jin-woo then sets out on a journey as he fights against all kinds of enemies, both man and monster, to discover the secrets of the dungeons and the true source of his powers." I gave every volume of this 4 stars, with the exception of Volume 8, which only gets 3. The series as a whole is 4 stars at any rate. All the same, I wouldn't recommend reading these books. I had a great time with them because I enjoyed the plot quite a bit, but objectively, these books are not well written. First of all, the descriptions are fairly scant. Occasionally, we'll get decent descriptions of things. The dungeon chamber where Jin-woo first gets his powers, for example, gets a fair rundown. But mostly the author seems to assume that since most of it is basically modern day, we are familiar with what things look like and never bothers. Settings, monsters, and characters are often introduced with little to no explanation as to how they appear. Second, there is just way too much onomatopoeia. It's constant and often feels like it's standing in place of actual descriptions of what's happening. Third, Jin-woo is constantly bringing up his stat window to check on something, which takes up half a page every time. More often than not, the only thing that's changed is his level and base stats, agility, stamina, wisdom, and whatnot. And the author then has to explain what we're supposed to be taking note of anyway, so it pretty much always felt like a waste of space that broke up the story's flow. And lastly, the author doesn't do a good job of threading characters through the narrative. For a while at the start, we spend a fair amount of time with a recruiter for one of the guilds who wants Jin-woo to join, but Jin-woo refuses and the character disappears entirely. We also get some time with his guild leader, who eventually figures out that Jin-woo can level up, but nothing comes of that, and at a certain point he stops being in the story at all as well. It takes quite a while for the story to introduce Jin-woo's love interest, who then pops in and out of the story with large stretches between. Not to mention, it takes forever for there to be any indication that Jin-woo even cares about her at all. Though I do appreciate how completely non-horny this power fantasy is, considering how horny they tend to be. This character issue isn't the worst thing in the world, and certainly it'd be hard to keep everyone marginally in focus throughout, but I feel like the author could have done a better job weaving the more important characters in, and maybe spent a little less time with characters that were only important for one specific incident. All this to say, if you're curious, I recommend starting with the comic rather than the books. I started with the series, read the comic so I could see the rest of the story, and then found out there were books. I read them hoping they might expand on the story and world, but honestly, the book and the comic are very nearly one for one. There are minor changes, but from what I remember, they mostly improve what's already there. I'm not saying don't read the books, I just don't think you should start with them. Aside from those general flaws with the writing, the books are a lot of fun. It is the most blatant kind of power fantasy. Jinwoo gains the ability to level up, and pretty much nothing is a challenge for him after that. You'd think that would be pretty boring, but reading about him protecting the people around him while trying to find ways to level up and not step on other hunters' toes doing it is surprisingly entertaining. Eventually, we start to get the explanation for what's up with the gates and why Jinwoo is so powerful, and that also creates some points of interest, although honestly, I like the books better prior to that storyline. I think that's probably all I can say without spoilers. If you don't like spoilers, now is the time to pause or close the video. For everyone else, let's talk details. There's another point in these books that I generally consider bad writing, and I think it happens more than once, although I can only remember the one specific incident. It comes pretty late in the game though, so it gets to live in the spoiler section. One thing I absolutely hate in books is when the author has been keeping information from the protagonist, but they reach the point where the protagonist needs to learn it before they want the reader to know it. So they go out of their way to show that the protagonist learns it, but continues to hide it from the reader. I'm not sure that's all that clear, so I'll give you the example. At some point, Jinwoo is invited back to the dungeon where it all began. He beats the antagonist that's trying to kill him because they think he's unworthy of being the Shadow Monarch, and then he gets part of a memory. At the end of the memory, another character says something to the real Shadow Monarch that Jinwoo can't hear because the memory is corrupted or something. Really, it's because he's not supposed to know yet. Later, we revisit this memory when Jinwoo completely integrates the powers of the Shadow Monarch as his own. We once again see the other character saying something to the Shadow Monarch, and Jinwoo hears it this time, and he, smiles to himself because it's very important information. But the book goes on to talk around what that information is without actually revealing it. This then necessitates revisiting this moment much more briefly, again later, so we, the reader, can be in on the secret. It's just an extremely frustrating experience, and it shows the hand of the author so blatantly that it's guaranteed to take you out of the story completely. I think it's lazy and bad writing, and I loathe it with my entire being. Incidentally, there is a way to do this that isn't nearly as jarring, which I also encountered in a book around the same time. That is, the character ruminates on something they know that the reader doesn't, but just before they can reveal what it is, someone interrupts their train of thought and the story moves on. It's still kind of annoying, but at least it isn't quite as blatantly excluding the reader. Other than that, I wanted to go over why I didn't like the last volume as much. For starters, the main plot wraps up pretty early on, so most of the book is just an extended epilogue. That's not terrible, really. The way the books unfold, Jinwoo ends up resetting the world so that the gates never began appearing. So it's interesting to see what lives some of the characters lead when they aren't hunters. The biggest problem I had with this part of Volume 8 was that it wasn't entirely in order, which was frustrating. If they had been in proper chronological order, I might have rated the book as high as the others. There were some other issues with it, of course. Eventually, Jinho, who is Jinwoo's right-hand man throughout the series, tells Jinwoo he's going to propose to Jin-ah, Jinwoo's sister. This is cute at face value, but having had absolutely zero build-up anywhere in the series, it irritated me. I'm not actually sure Jinho and Jin-ah met in the main storyline, and in the epilogue we never once see them interacting before they're getting engaged either. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but if this was going to be a plot point, I wish the author had at least hinted at it as a possibility earlier. The main thing I didn't like about Volume 8 was the stories that weren't showing what the world was like now that Jinwoo had won. There are a couple of stories, all of which switch to first-person perspective, that don't really fall into that category and are almost entirely terrible. There's one that takes place before the series starts, from the perspective of someone trying to convince Jinwoo to quit being a hunter before he dies, that felt entirely pointless. We also get a story where Jinwoo dreams the big bad took over his body at the start of the story, which is also quite pointless as well as kind of confusing because it isn't explained at all until the end. And then there's a story from the perspective of one of Jinwoo's shadow soldiers that's mostly just mindless fluff and feels pointless and boring. Overall, the last book isn't bad, it just had too many things I didn't like for me to rate it as well as the rest. Still, the series as a whole is great, and I would absolutely recommend checking out the comic. That's all I have to say about Solo Leveling. If you like this video, I hope you'll watch more in the future. Thanks for watching this one. Bye!